Welcome back, everyone. So, given this past week, seen a few anniversaries, including 1 year since George Floyd and murder, and the 100 years since the Tulsa massacre, and the ongoing uptake or uprising, or what's the word? Up in the news, not that it's ever gone away, but in AAPI violence. Of course, the ongoing oppression of immigrants at the border, and also the high rate and really very underreported of missing and murder Indigenous people and women in particular, and then various wars and conflicts. And I wanted to offer something that supports us to be with difficulties. I know there is, I think, hope in the air and sense of a lot of energy, given that the vaccine is starting to take a hold, at least in the United States, and yeah, I thought really, I don't know, as a person of color, I'm always trying to figure out how to negotiate information coming in, going out, emotions responding, thoughts, sensations that come with those. So tonight I wanted to talk about one of the paramitas, Kashanti is the name. Now, let me first start by saying that the paramitas, so that's the Sanskrit word for in the Pali is the paramis. So for those who may not know, the Buddhism was an oral religion. And so that's why you hear things repeated 3 times when you read the sutras. And then the first recorded language of Buddhism is Pali. So the way of the elder, or the older popular practice of Buddhism for the Theravadins. And so in those are called the paramis, and there are actually 10 of those. I am from the Mahayanas, the later in history of Buddhism. So the Mahayanas, which Zen and Vajrayana are part of, and many others, of course, we only have 6, right? And they're called the paramitas. Now, so I'm going to say paramitas because that's what I'm familiar with. And they're thought of, they show up in several places, but mostly in the, so the 6 are from the, what I call the Mahayana Sutras, so the Lotus Sutra, and the large sutra on the perfection of wisdom, the Prajnaparamita. And so the paramitas are considered, para means big, mita means to cross across. So they consider practices that an enlightened person would cultivate and develop. In fact, here's from a text: is a disciple asked the Buddha, how many bases for training are there for those seeking enlightenment? The Buddha replied, there are 6. Zen did a very good version of sharing with you the first one, and that is dana, or generosity. Sila is next, often translated as morality. We could say the precepts, we could say compassionate living, conduct. The third is kashanti, or patience, energy, or virya, meditation, or bhavana, or samadhi, and then wisdom, prajna. So today I'm only talking about patience. Just because I know in your head you're going, well, what are the other four? Since you say there are 10. So I'll just tell them to you. Skillful means, or paya, aspiration. You know the word for aspiration in Pali. Power, and then knowledge. Right, so again, I'm only talking about the 6. So in terms of the 6, they're into 2 groupings. If you don't know already, in Buddhism, there are lots of lists of numbers of 2 this, 3 that, and things are broken up, which I myself, being a geek, really love it because it helps me to have a sense of things. And so the first 3, generosity, morality, and patience, are what considered virtuous practices that are for anyone. And then the remaining 3, which are energy or zeal, meditation, and wisdom, are classically talked about more as spiritual practice. So again, perfection here is practices in character building, essentially. Again, classically for the bodhisattva, or the bodhisattva is the bodhisattva ideal is a person who is driven by bodhicitta, the wish to awaken others, and are not going to do it. I will not do it for myself until we all are enlightened together. That's the classic definition of a bodhisattva. Again, a very Mahayanist. So a way to put that is a bodhisattva comes from the aspiration to live for the benefit of all beings. That's what a bodhisattva is. So again, today I'm just going to talk about Kashanti. And that's often translated as patience. That's going to be the one that you see the most. Tolerance is another one. And then in terms of more literal translation, the words Kashanti has been translated as unaffected by, able to bear, or able to withstand. So sometimes you also will see it as forbearance, and it comes from the more literal. And most of this today, in terms of the information, I'll be talking from Dale S. Wright. There's a book called The Sixth Perfection, a really great book, and from Robert Aiken, also on the book on the Sixth Perfection, and then from Thich Nhat Hanh. So Dale S. Wright, quoting the Dalai Lama from Ethics for a New Millennium, but this is in his book, says about Kashanti, indicates strength of character, a composure, and a constancy of purpose that allow a bodhisattva to continue pursuing universal enlightenment in spite of enormous difficulty. So I'll say that again. Indicates strength of character, a composure, and a constancy of purpose that allow a bodhisattva to continue pursuing universal enlightenment in spite of enormous difficulty. So this is what is, so why they're called the perfection, they are not like a, classically it is a noun, but again, these are qualities to develop. So perfecting might be a better use. And in fact, there are 3 kinds of Kashanti. First, the perfection of Kashanti begins with acceptance of the 4 noble truths, including the truth of suffering. Right? Through our practice, our attention turns away from our own suffering and toward the suffering of others. So again, this is what we're learning. What is the, classically, of course, what is suffering? What are the roots or causes of suffering? the origin classically. Of course, those who I see, a lot of you are in class with, in the Dharma Being Anti-Racist with Me series, class series. So the second in the engaged framing, as I have it, would be how were you taught? What are the conditions? How are you taught systemically? By your families, that system, then by your community, and then by larger systems, like systems of oppression, for instance. So how are we taught? These are the roots that we know what is suffering, whose suffering is important, how to be with suffering, right? These are things that we're taught. So part of our practice is to really have a sense then of how did I come to this, to my beliefs about what's important to me? How should I deal with my suffering? How should I be with who's suffering, that person versus that person, that being versus that being, you know? And so our practice is really to actually keep opening up. And a bodhisattva in particular is to keep opening up to going, oh, that's a suffering that I didn't know about. That's a suffering that I'm more able to bear, right? This is what we're practicing. We're practicing to be able to say, oh, I'm not going to be overwhelmed by that. And I think this is part of both practice maturity and a certain sense of life maturity, right? You start to have a sense, oh, I know when I was a teenager, right? I was like sarcastic, but that was a way of deflecting. Now that I see pictures of myself when I was a teenager, I always had to sneer, because I was just like, and I was so cynical because there was so much suffering in the world. Because I wanted to, when I graduated, I was going to join the Peace Corps to save the world. Literally, I confess, that was right? So I saw the suffering, but I couldn't hold it. I couldn't. As a teenager, the way I dealt with it was to be cynical and jaded because I couldn't bear it. And so for me, practice is really how am I learning to be with suffering, right? But by that, I don't mean, that we need to go looking for suffering and I'm just gonna, this is why I'm gonna give you some more definitions as we go along, but there is a sense of this, right? Of understanding. So first here, we're understanding what suffering is, but it helps us then to have a sense of it better. For instance, my take, say on racism, is that when I understood that there was a system of oppression called racism, right? Then I understood that I could bear it more because it didn't feel so personal. Didn't feel like it was just someone being mean to me without a reason. Like now I had a reason. So it's an understanding that the root of that is that this person, and we are taught in the system of white supremacy to have this framing, this way of othering each other and also determining whose suffering is more important than others, right? In this system. So when I understood that this is a whole bigger system, then I'm not saying that makes it better and right, mind you. I'm just saying that it helps me to really understand why someone might be racist towards me and then not take it personally. And in doing that, I then could take care of my own more, including perhaps going, sorry, you think that, but I don't have to accept that, right? It's like people used to call me chink or, and tell me to go home. Now, if someone does, I'd be like, I am home, right? Like, on the street, right? I'm not going to give them the time of day and have a conversation with them, right? Especially if they're, for those who remember my memory, passing by in a car or something, right? So when I have a sense that this is not, someone's acting in a way, even though the impact, their intended impact is the same, But now that I have a sense of it in wider system, I'm not going to I have learned that I don't have to react to it in the same way because it isn't about me. It's about their ignorance. So that's the first one. So endurance of hardship. Actually, sorry, that's the broader of Kashanti, is to understand the Four Noble Truths. Right? So the third, by the way, is how it ends, how it can end. And I just basically told you an example of how it can end. And then where do I have agency to not take on? So again, notice this is about what do I let in and what do I have good boundaries against. People can always say all sorts of shit at me, but I do not have to take it all in. This also can mean I can choose where I want to be, or where is it safe to share what kind of information, like, like I can talk about this directly with you all because this is a POC Sangha. Again, doesn't mean that I might not do it at another Sangha, but because I realize that we have a sense of the system of oppression of racism, that's why we come to POC Sangha, I would think, right? One of the many reasons, right? So we have a common language and of experience too. So the first is this endurance of hardship. By the way, this from Robert Aiken. The Chinese ideograph for Kashanti is a sword over the heart. Does that give you a visual image of it? I think of it much more as not like stabbing my heart, right? But more like defending the heart, endurance of hardship. So we have a sense that we do need to protect our heart. Sometimes I think we come to practice and we think, oh, I should just be, like a soft heart and accept everything. I don't know how many people come to me in PD and say, people did this to me and people did that to me. And I'm like, just don't take it. Don't take it, right? And so it is important to protect the heart. Now we practice to also open the heart, like in the meditation, because we want to have the agency of having control of our heart, of responding as we want, as opposed to reacting to things. So when is it that I am willing to open my heart? And when am I willing to protect it? Right? And again, the key there is also not that I have some sense that I can be the one. I have the agency to regulate that. Right? So that's one. But two, that I can regulate it. So this is why we have to practice doing it. And three, that I have some wisdom about when and how. So that's important. So this all comes with practice. So we do have to endure hardship, and it's true of life. I mean, so I'm talking about race, but it's true. You're going to stub your toe. You're going to eat dinner, and you're run out of food, and maybe you're still hungry, or it wasn't sweet enough, or it didn't taste enough. There'll be some dissatisfaction in life. That's just part of life, right? So there are variations here. So we have enduring of hardship as part of life, in a sense. Right? So by these truths, they don't mean that we shouldn't have them. The truth, this is where the receiving, embracing, and transforming is kind of like the three ways to work with the Four Noble Truths, right? Can you identify what it is? Can you embrace it? Meaning, can you get a little closer and examine it, investigate it? And then can you be transformed by it? Does it have meaning for you? It isn't just done to you. What is the meaning for you now about it? So again, sickness, old age, and death is also part of enduring hardship. The second is more what we would say patience, or gentle forbearance, sometimes you'll hear. And actually it's about tolerance in human relationships. So the capacity to tolerate injuries of the body and ego caused by other people. That's why tolerance is a good one. Because we don't practice, to be by ourselves in a cave, especially for a bodhisattva. I like to say a bodhisattva is never by themselves, because if you're practicing for the benefit of all beings, it includes at least one other person or being than yourself. And if you're waiting so that we all go together to be enlightened, then at least one other person, right, or being. So relationship is part of it, of all human life, really, because even if you are by yourself, who grew the food for you, who brought the food for you, right, who helped you into the world, who made your clothing. So we're always in relationship. So the spirit of forgiveness, injury is forgiven, and the occasion is used as an opportunity to reveal the essential harmony of all beings. There are no exceptional circumstances that would justify other kinds of responses. This is from Aiken. So don't forget the bodhisattva. There's the bodhisattva ideal. And the perfections are really the perfection to be perfected. So this is like what we're aspiring to be able to forgive all injury. It doesn't mean that there isn't a process that you have to go through, or that it isn't a hard one to do, or that part of it you might need to say, I can't do it right now, or I need a rest from that, right? So this is not about what should, this is the ideal. So then the last is the acceptance of truth, not any truth, in particular, the truth about oneself and the world. Essentially, that practice has difficulties. And so the capacity to tolerate more comprehensive visions of reality that undermines long-standing habits of mental insecurity in particular. So again, this is why a lot of practice is about having a sense that I can be with complexity. And some of you have heard, a lot of people come to Zen and they want that Zen garden, right? There's a rock that's beautiful, costs a lot of money. The gravel is just so perfect. Maybe gentle music, bamboo waving in the wind. Having been at a Zen temple in Japan, we were out there weeding little weeds every day, right? Even before we meditated. Cleaning, making that garden so beautiful takes a lot of work, a lot of suffering from those of us doing it. Right? I'm kidding about that part. Right? So nothing, this is what we want to come and we think this is the ideal, and it's the same about life. I know I came to practice thinking, I'll just simplify. Doesn't that sound so Zen? Like simple. Why can't things be simple? But what I have learned is that I am learning to tolerate complexity. Right? And how can I make it simple? Because mostly I complicate by my expectations, by my sense of how things should be, me or you or the situation. Right? Many years, I was like, racism should not happen. Right? It is true that racism is really painful, but there's no way to say that it should not happen now, because it is here. We can't not accept the karma that it is here. There's no place in the world that there's no racism. Different people are the who we defined as the oppressed is different, but there's racism all over the world. And in various places, there are different ways that it manifests differently, for sure. So here's from Aiken too. This is a way of working out bodhicitta. Remember, that's the wish to bring awakening, the mind of awakening, basically. It involves difficult, sometimes painful practice, a self-imposed limit upon the appetites, and a drastic avoidance of the ordinary worldly distractions. Gradually, you purify yourself, Wumen wrote, eliminating mistaken knowledge and attitudes you have held from the past. Step by step, you eliminate your ideas of a permanent soul, clarifying the oneness of life and death as you come to understand the unity of inside and outside. This is not just a philosophical practice and is not just working on yourself in a psychological sense, but the intellect and the psyche have important roles. Essentially, practice is about receiving, right? So it does take knowing some Dharma information, 3 this, 4 that, 5 that, 6 this, and then a sense of embracing that in your life and how does it work in your life, not just as ideas, but how do you practice that? And then how are you transformed by that? And which, by the way, is not just a head transformation, it's a body and I'm going to say soul, but technically no soul in Buddhism. So your body and your emotions and your thoughts are transformed. And so it's like, as Suzuki Roshi likes to say, right? Practice is like, we think, okay, there's a pool of Dharma with a beautiful rainbow that from a waterfall that falls down, and I jump in and I'm enlightened. But enlightenment is much more like you walking through the fog. It's hard to see sometimes in fog, isn't it? And slowly you're permeated with the wetness, right? It nourishes you. It's really good for the skin, right? So I'm told. Right? So slowly permeates. This is a transformation. All right. Aiken also says, this is not merely control of impatience. We might think it's the opposite of patience. This is not merely control of impatience, but the virtue that appears in the absence of hatred, repugnance, and malice. Like the other paramitas, it is an attitude that arises from bodhicitta, the mind of enlightenment, rather than from guidelines imposed from the outside. This is not merely control of impatience, but the virtue that appears in the absence of hatred, repugnance, and malice. Anyone who calls me a chink and tells me to go home, can I respond without hatred, repugnance, and malice? Again, doesn't mean I should accept it or that I shouldn't yell back. Sorry, I'm already home, right? Or believe that they are ignorant. But is it from a place that is not from hatred, greed, and delusion? Which, by the way, are called the poisons in Buddhism. All right. Thich Nhat Hanh. Now, I wanted to include Thich Nhat Hanh in the paramitas because he's so good at giving what I like to think less classic and makes sense to me. And he calls this paramita, Kashanti, as inclusiveness. Inclusiveness is the capacity to receive, embrace, and transform. I believe inclusiveness better conveys the Buddha's teaching. When we practice inclusiveness, we don't have to suffer or forbear, even when we have to embrace suffering and injustice. The other person says or does something that makes us angry. he, she, they, inflicts on us some kind of injustice, but if our heart is large enough, we don't suffer. By the way, mind and heart is the same in Buddhism. So bodhicitta is as much a heart of awakening as a mind of awakening. I'll say that again, quote again, because I think it's beautiful. Inclusiveness is the capacity to receive, embrace, and transform. I believe inclusiveness better conveys the Buddhist teaching. When we practice inclusiveness, we don't have to suffer or forbear, even when we have to embrace suffering and injustice. The other person says or does something that makes us angry. He, she, they inflicts on us some kind of injustice, but if our heart is large enough, we don't suffer. So, I think when have experienced trauma, which of course we all have as people of color, the ordinary become more than ordinary. Things are amplified. And a drastic change has been done to this being's worldview. That's part of the classic definition of trauma. So for me, hopefully with this framing, right, in a way what we're doing is we're healing as a way to return to ordinary life, to an ordinary worldview for this being, that life is safe, life is happy, life is peaceful and easeful, life has protection and safety. Oh, I said safe already, so that's key to me, obviously. Which one am I missing, folks? Life includes well-being. Because the ordinary is connection. In trauma, the sense of being isolated is part of the trauma response. We've been separated often from a sense of community. That's othering, right? I feel connected in this situation and something happens that makes me feel other, separate. So there's a sense of connection, of love, of safety, of peace, and well-being. And in fact, when you have those things, then you feel connected also. So perhaps this is a way that I'm thinking as the middle way of trauma. So with these practices, we can find ourselves within the window of tolerance. And some of you might have heard me say that so much to me of practice is to help us be able to build the capacity to be able to receive, embrace, and transform difficulties. So that as we're meditating, we're learning to have much more, not only a capacity of what is diseaseful, dissatisfying, discontent, of dukkha, we're also practicing to have flexibleness of it. So we actually, also this way we could go to, right? Both width and depth, and inside and outside, by the way. So we practice so that we can have the flexibility of managing, or a result. Actually, I would say that the result of practice is that when things feel too much, we know what we can do to feel more back centeredness. When things feel too high, we can come back down. When things feel too low, we can lift ourselves up. And of course, by we, I mean, for myself and with others and for others. So that we can regulate when there's strong emotions and thoughts and there's dysregulation.